So I have lifted the 1 beer limit today because of the light turnout. So congratulations for getting out in the cold today and coming to the best meeting you've ever experienced, will ever experience until next month. Woo! Sure. So a couple things I want to say. First off is thank you very much, Mark, Albert, and Loyola. This is a really great venue, is it not? Why did we not bring electronic helicopters with us? Because we could do some fancy stuff. I don't know, it'll probably crash. I want to thank, all of our sponsors for buying our 2-drink limit today, because I want another drink. And also Loyola also bought the food today, which was really awesome. And this venue's great, it really is. But finally, that's not all, folks. There's more. Video is back. Thank you, Chicago Latino TV. He has a show. He does professional recording. He's getting more professional services. Hit him up if you need some video recording. We are finally back online. Expect a lot of downloads, folks. I mentioned Beasley's talk on the Gill. This is going to be even more shadow. This is going to be better than that. Okay, Beasley can just sit down. Okay, he's not even here. He can just sit down, forget his books and all that pretty stuff, and all his hackery. We really want to hit all levels, so we haven't hit Django for a while, guys. We haven't hit, Raspberry Pi stuff for a while, We haven't broken into any banks and got arrested for a while. I did, but that's a different story. And then, go ahead. This is Jason Wither.
So just a couple of announcements on the conference run. If anybody's in New York next weekend, I think on the 22nd and 23rd, PyData is going to be in New York. So that's like a data science specific conference. I think it runs for 2 days, tutorials, talks, things like that. I think the talks will be online for those who can't make it. In addition, PyCon is coming up. It's going to be, I think, from April 8th of 2015. So they have early bird tickets that are on sale, saved $50 on admission, which means $50 more to spend on booze at the actual PyCon. Those are, I think, 60% sold out, and they're going to the first 800 people. There's generally about maybe 3,000 people that show up to PyCon, and it's sold out every year for the past however many years. So I think it's good to kind of get those tickets early and organize that trip, because it's definitely one of the must-dos.
Give her a warm welcome.
Introducing myself, I'm Asma Mehjabeen. I'm a graduate student here at Loyola, and I'm doing my master's in computer science. Today, I would like to talk about how hidden Markov models can be used to improve activity recognition in patients with incomplete spinal cord injuries. The main motivation behind the study was to be able to successfully identify the activities of patients that are suffering with motor disabilities, such as those with spinal cord injury presented here. Patients undergo various therapies to improve motor function. But to know which therapies are the most effective and how to adjust the parameters of those therapies, it is important to be able to collect data on patient outcomes as conveniently, objectively, and continuously as possible. And that is why we need activity recognition. Now, what exactly is activity recognition? It's just a technique to be able to measure the current activity levels of the subject based on data collected from certain sensors such as accelerometers, gyroscopes, etc. Like today, many commercial devices are available that can measure step counts, calorie estimates, or even general activity levels. But most of them are designed for healthy subjects and may not give very accurate results when used on patient populations with motor disabilities. Previous study conducted earlier has shown that activity recognition accuracy can greatly improve if we adapt our classifiers to data collected from movements of the certain patient populations. And successful activity recognition can really help researchers and clinicians assess the effect of those therapies on the behavior at home. Here's a clip showing the recorded accelerometer data. As you can see, it shows the accelerations along the X, Y, and Z axis. Like even a common device such as a regular mobile phone will give you signals like this. And based on information from this clip, we can like identify the activities such as like sitting, wheeling, walking, stair climbing, etc. How is this done? Like commonly this is done by like extracting 10-second clips from the data and having your algorithms classify those data based on features within that time frame. And since we only consider features within that certain clip, it's called a static classification. Some of the examples include linear regression, logistic regression, support vector machines. Basically, like very similar to linear regression, but here it predicts the value of a categorical variable given the values of like continuous, dependent categorical variable like given one or more independent variables. It usually gives the probability of outcome of a categorical variable given one or more independent variables based on a logistic function. So that's where the name logistic regression comes from. Even though like static classification can give us accurate results, we wanted to find out if we can better improve the accuracy by augmenting the static classifiers with a dynamic model instead. So that's why we also like chose a dynamic estimation. What dynamic estimation does is it not only considers the information present in this one particular clip, but it also considers the context of the clip over time, which leads to higher accuracies. Some of the examples are like hidden Markov models and neural networks with time lag. So here's a little like pictorial representation of a hidden Markov model. We do not know what, like imagine that we want to predict based on online data. We want to find out if a person's friend on social media is a good friend or is it really a friend on social media. So we're just given certain observations, like is the person tagged very often in pictures with the other person, or if the person only likes and comments on person's status updates. So based on information like this, we can able to like hidden Markov models are able to predict the actual current state of the user. So what exactly a Markov model is, it has certain states, for example, walking and standing, and there are certain probabilities associated with the states. Like the model transitions from one state to the next, and it follows the Markov property. That is, the current state only depends on the previous state and not on the complete history. And as you can see, like in a Markov chain, the states are directly observable. But a hidden Markov model is exactly like a Markov model. Like it has n states. The process transitions from state to state. It assumes that like the states are hidden. Also, each state generates emissions or observations, and based on the observations, we can identify the current state of the user. For example, like here's a model. We know that the person was in like state walking at time t, and we know that there's a certain like these are observations, the walking probability and the standing probability. So based on these observations and the previous state and like certain like transition probabilities, we can identify the current state as like standing or whatever. The method that we used was movement data was collected and labeled for 13 ambulatory subjects with who wore an accelerometer worn on their waist. The activities included lying, sitting, walking, stair climbing, standing, and wheeling. And each of those the labeled accelerometer signals were parsed into 2-second clips, and an extensive set of like time series features were extracted from those clips, and like those clips were then classified using machine learning. And this is how the classification process is. So we considered like each of the individual 2-second clips and extracted certain features. For example, the values of the x, y, and z axis, like the acceleration values, and the mean along each of those axes, the standard deviations, and so on. And we passed those to the regularized logistic regression classifier, which gave us probabilistic estimates. For example, if the person was walking, it gave us estimates like there's a 90% probability that the person is walking, there's a 60%, there's a 5% probability that the person may be lying, and there's a 2% probability that the person is like doing some other activity like that. And we fed those probabilistic estimates as observations to our hidden Markov model, which also considered the previous state and gave us the current state of the user. And again, like as you can see, the standard deviations in walking and stair climbing are almost the same. That's why our the static classifier got confused between these two activities, and that was also shown in the results that we achieved. So the activities along the columns are the true activities that the user was currently doing, and along the rows, it's the activity that the model predicted. So if the model was like 100% correct, we would want all the values along the diagonals and none of them along the other rows and columns. But here, as you can see, like if the true activity was wheeling, there were 55 misclassified samples that said the activity was, the user was sitting. And when the user was actually walking, there were 78 misclassified samples that said the user was actually stair climbing. When we did a tenfold cross-validation on our logistic regression model, we achieved an overall accuracy of 96.6%. And again, like when we did a leave one subject out cross-validation, we got an accuracy of 96.7. But when we applied our hidden Markov model classifier, the accuracy improved to 98.5%, which was great. We kind of reduced the error rates by half. And this is a random sample of the output showing the effect of the hidden Markov model classifier. The LR classifier showed fluctuations in the activities. It predicted the user as standing when the user was actually stair climbing, but the hybrid classifier cleaned out the data pretty much. And it also considered the transitions, like since the hidden Markov model also considers the context of the clip, it was able to recognize that it's more likely that the person transitions from walking to stair climbing than from standing to stair climbing. There were many other works conducted on activity recognition. Like some of them included the activity tracking with mobile phones, and this was also applied on patients with Parkinson's disease. So it's not only applicable to just incomplete spinal cord injury, but also on other papers as well. And one of the authors of the paper is like sitting right here in front of us. It's like Mark Shapiro, the co-author of the third paper, using mobile phones for activity recognition in Parkinson's patients. I would like to conclude by saying that by using like static classifiers for initial activity estimates and HMMs to basically smooth out any irregular classifications, we can achieve a much better activity recognition accuracy. And with more reliable activity recognition, we would finally be able to conveniently, objectively, and continuously measure the impact of therapies on behavior at home. And I would like to acknowledge the Pervasive and Ambient Computing Lab here at Loyola, headed by Dr. Mark Albert, and the Department of Computer Science, and also Ranulfo Neto, who was working on this project earlier this semester, and the Max Natter Lab for Rehabilitation Technologies and Outcomes Research, the director Arun Jayaraman, and Johannes Aziz for much of the data collection, and the Bayesian Behavior Lab at Northwestern University, and Steve Antos and Conrad Cording. Thank you. Sure.
Okay. So did the HMM, the reason why it improved the classification is because it could understand the concept of switching, like the user's unlikely to switch from laying down to stair climbing. Like if you see laying down and then that stair climbing, it's likely that they're going from laying down to walking. Is that why you did better?
Why is there an increase in the accuracy when we used an HMM as compared to just applying the logistic regression? So I would like to say that like HMMs also consider the context of the clip over the time. So there are also like certain probabilities associated with the hidden Markov model. Like there are certain transition probabilities defined. So when we feed that transition matrix into the model, it considers the probabilities that are defined inside it, and like based on that, it makes the observations too. So like when we define the probability matrix, then like we define that the probability of transitioning from a like a standing state to a state climbing state is less when compared to the probability of transitioning between a walking state and like the state climbing state. So based on those observations and based on like the other probabilistic estimates that the logistic regression classifier gave us, it predicts that it just smooths out the data, basically. Sure.
So you said that this is for like people with spinal cord injuries. Like, what's the major difference between just kind of helping individuals and people with spinal cord injuries for like just motion tracking like this?
So his question is like why the regular commercially available devices don't work well on patient populations. It's majorly because the movements of the patient populations are not exactly are not comparable to the movements of like regular healthy individuals. Like if you consider patients with Parkinson's disease, the way they walk is different from the way a normal human, like a healthy subject walks. So like the acceleration values and stuff, like they differ between the two individuals. So that's why they cannot be applied. Sure. Actually, the sensor data was already the data was already collected last semester by Johannes Aziz. But as far as I know, like he used just the accelerometer sensor, which the patients wore on their waist, and we just took those signals, and we just like from the data I saw, I just had the values of the x, y, and z axis, like the acceleration values. And based on that, I like find out the other features, and then I use the Python's like sklearn toolkit and the classifiers from there, and I've like trained my models. I would like to like go back to a slide to actually like show that. Sure. So her question was, how did I combine the two models together? This is how I did that. So like I extracted the features, and I like submitted those to the regularized logistic regression classifier, which gave me probabilistic estimates. For example, if the activity was walking, it showed that like it gave me probabilistic estimates even for the other activities as well. So taking those as observations, I fed that to my hidden Markov model classifier, and which also took into account like the transition matrix earlier that I gave, and it predicted the current state of the user.
Sort of test devices or automatic classifiers that can be deployed on patients, or is this to analyze existing data whereas a regular activity trainer wouldn't be able to pick this type of stuff up? So what's the application of these models that you're getting out of these data sets?
He's asking about the application of the models. Is it just for just the lab collected data?
Or is this something that is going to ultimately be deployed in a device that a patient might be able to wear and be able to help them figure out when they're stressing their body?
Our main motivation was to like ultimately deploy it on a device so that it could really help patients. We just tested this on lab collected data, and for now we just tested it on incomplete spinal cord injury patients, but we build our models so that like even you can feed in data from a patient suffering from Parkinson's disease, and still like you should be able to get an accuracy that's like much higher when compared to using a regular device that's like designed for a healthy subject. So ultimately we if this works out well, then we can definitely like deploy it in a device. He's asking if we just always use the 2-second clips, or like how did we window the data basically. So we just used the 2-second clips. Like how we did was our initial data set had like some 3,000 rows of data per subject, like just an approximation. So for that, we extracted 2-second clips from there, and if 80% of the activity was if an activity was very prominent, 80% of the clip showed the same activity, then we consider that as one sample for the model, and we moved on with that. We are just aggregating it as one sample, so it was that. Sure.
Of model you're using the previous state to inform your decision about the next state. Is there any way that you can also do that in reverse? Because obviously if you were laying down, then stair climbing is unlikely, but if you were going in the opposite direction, then stair climbing be unlikely after lying down as well. Is it reversible, or is there any way you can get more data by combining future and past states since you have them all?
His question is if we can apply hidden Markov models to find out the future state based on the past state.
Yeah, if because you have all the data already gathered, you're not predicting current.
The past state based on the future state, right? So hidden Markov models usually they consider the previous states to find out the current state, but there are also other problems that you can definitely solve using hidden Markov models. So some of them are learning your transition matrix and stuff. So that are classified as learning problems, and there are decoding problems that we did here. So definitely we can try that. We use the sklearn classifiers from Python, and for the initial data pre-processing, we use the pandas. Data frames, and we cleaned out the data using pandas, and after that we used the classifiers from sklearn, and then coded everything basically in Python to just code the algorithm. We just wrote straight Python scripts. We used the n-thought canopy distribution, and we coded it in that.
And did you use any Python to generate the plots?
This one was from MATLAB, so no.
Last question. She's doing a really good job, by the way, answering these questions.
Suppose you had healthy patient data, Parkinson's disease data, and spinal cord injury data. What would you have to change in your model or your method to make a model that could tell the difference between those three groups based on this motion data?
So his question is if we can apply the same model to different patient populations as well. So one of the papers I showed here, I'd like to. Okay, so it's not listed in the here, but a study conducted earlier was done on how activity recognition generalizes what happens if we use data collected from healthy subjects and then train our models on that, and use that to test the data collected from patients with motor disabilities such as Parkinson's patients. So we the study concluded that there's a lot of difference because the accuracies we get from the healthy subjects, if we just test it on healthy subjects, then we get higher accuracies, but if we test it on patients with motor disabilities, then the accuracy lowers very greatly. So the way we set up our model is that if we train our model with data from a particular patient population, then it can predict the outcome very with a greater accuracy. So if you want to apply the same model to patients with Parkinson's disease, all I have to do is just change the training set to the training set collected from the patients with Parkinson's disease.
Okay, so really what I would like to see is I'd like to be able to collect training data over a period of months and watch a patient who has a disease become better. So in order to do that, you have to be able to classify this patient is diseased or this patient is healthy. So how would you make a model that can tell you whether the patient has a disease or is healthy? based on this data? That's my question.
Oh, for now, like, we're not really working on that, so.
Okay. Good job. That was awesome.
Very good. Answering questions. Very good.
All right. So, hey everyone. I'm Isaac. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's pretty cold outside. So, I'm a junior in high school, like my great announcer said. And I'm actually from the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy in Aurora. And I came here tonight as a result of a program that my high school has, IMSA. And it's called the SIR program, the Student Investigation and Research Program. And basically with it, I take Wednesdays off of class to instead do research at universities or separate locations. And I chose to do my research with Dr. Mark Albert at Loyola. So that's where I got this. And what Dr. Albert and I are studying is actually the existence of patterns of neural activity in the brain's visual system. So I'm going to ask everyone just to close their eyes for 1 second and open them. What just happened was that neural activity happens with retinal waves crossing over the eyes. And we're basically seeing how this happens, why it happens, and we're using Python to create a virtual model of the brain, of the visual cortex, and seeing why this happens. And with it, we're able to prove something called innate learning by comparing both the virtual and the natural examples. So 4 main topics I'm going to be talking about today. The visual system, 3 major parts, the retina, the lateral genetic nucleus, and the visual cortex. Basically, if we understand the visual system, that's a good basis to be able to understand everything else and seeing why the retinal activity occurs. Second, efficient coding is seeing how we can use efficient coding to create a virtual model, how to compress it, how to make it working well. Early visual development tells us how early on, before the eyes open, what the activity is that occurs, the retinal waves that happen. And innate learning is saying how, just kind of bringing it all together and saying why it happens. So start off with the visual system. We all know what the retina is. It's in the eye. It's on the back of the eye. It actually observes light from optic nerves. And what the retina does is that it transmits information to the lateral genetic nucleus, basically the LGN for short. And the LGN acts as the midway point between the retina and the visual cortex, and it carries information from the retina of the eye to the primary visual cortex, like I said, and the visual cortex then processes the information to see and make sense of it. And from the visual cortex, we get something called receptive fields. And what receptive fields is, it's the beginning of visual processing, and basically a way to say it's like a tiny part of an image. So for example, I have like a lone receptive field up there, and a group of receptive fields. And when I was making my speech, I was trying to think a way to compare it, and I guess the way to compare it to a group of people like you would be, it's kind of like pixels. It's an overlay of vision in the brain, and it's located in neurons, because the brain is basically just a whole network of neurons. And each neuron has a part in it where there's a place where a reaction takes place, a action-reaction spot, and that's what the receptive field is. It's where the neuron fires, and it's where the main processing takes place before vision actually occurs. So the visual cortex is the main location of where it creates these receptive fields. And the receptive fields have different properties, including position, orientation, frequency, and phase. For position and orientation, it's pretty self-explanatory. Position is just where it is, where the receptive field is located. For example, if you can see in the top right, they're kind of scattered around different places, top right, top left, middle. And orientation is basically just how they're rotated. Typically, when we view an image, there's data from both the left and right eyes, which when translated with efficient coding approaches, we can make into these receptive fields. So that's the main thing about the visual system, but how do we actually code that? How do we make that? Well, we have an efficient coding hypothesis, which basically says, well, we can make the visual system virtually and we can understand it by using different levels of analysis. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Mars level analysis. We changed it because we're not including hardware as much in this, but we're including the representation algorithm and computational theory. So actually most neural network approaches use representation algorithms to try and understand what's going on in the visual system. And they also use computational theory to reduce the amount of redundancy in the neural code. So this is basically just saying how we can simplify things and how we can make this code occur. So a way to do that is using the efficient coding approaches. So basically, animals have adapted over time. They'll view a natural scene, and actually what it breaks down to is that we can take this natural scene and make it into these group of receptive fields, like seen over there. So we can take the natural scene, derive the visual input, and eventually make these receptive fields. The patches of the scene that we see above, they basically create a vector of intensity values, which we can then efficiently encode the basic filters to create the receptive fields. And that way, we can use computer programming, Python specifically, to emulate the brain. And the interesting thing is that the filters that we derive from this image, we've seen are structurally equivalent to the filters that are already present in the brain. So to maximize the efficiency of our code, we use sparse coding hypothesis. And what it does, it relies on efficiently analyzing the image by minimizing the number of active neurons that have to be processed and taught back. Basically, if it were to say, for example, if it were binary code, you'd be compressing the ones and zeros. And we require the compression because in the brain, every time a neuron fires, it takes some of the brain's resources. Because the brain is basically like a huge powerhouse. It takes up a lot of energy in the body. And as such, each time a neuron fires, it takes some of this energy to occur. So if we have sparse coding, it'll help us represent the entire image in a cleaner and more efficient way than without using it. So that's how we know, like, how does the visual system develop? That's what we need to know before we ask ourselves, how does the visual system develop? Because we know that if we have our code, we can see how it should develop, but we want to see how it does first. So universally, many different species actually have the same spontaneous activity I was talking about before, the retinal waves that occur. Previous studies show us that a wide variety of species have similarly patterned spontaneous activity in the visual system before the eyes actually open. And what that means to us, basically, is that despite all the major differences between different kinds of animals, all our brains are wired similarly when it comes to vision. And this is what I was talking about, the retinal waves. So when you all closed your eyes before, this is what happened. Retinal waves, this is an example that occurs over 12 seconds, where retinal waves start in the bottom left of the eye, and they cross over in a period of 12 seconds to the top right. And what retinal waves are, they're information received from the retina and translated from the visual cortex. And then these waves are a necessity when it comes to understanding how the neural activity works and what role it plays between different species. So to be able to actually understand all this, we use developmental strategies of innate learning in the early visual system. And so I just want to throw out some definitions right now. So there's innate and learned. So innate developmental strategy is saying, well, this occurs prior to visual experience. Like axon guidance cues that I have up there, it relies on innate developmental strategies. And then I also have the kitten, because a kitten learns with a learned developmental strategy, with experience. Through activity-based refinement, the visual system gets better and better over time, basically. Okay, so our main motivation for doing all this is to see and prove innate learning. So we have pre-eye opening and post-eye opening. And then we have two categories. The neural activity, or basically the natural scene that occurs. And then we also have the algorithm that we're trying to create with Python. So what we know is that the spontaneous activity, or the retinal wave that I showed you before, over 12 seconds, occurs before the eyes open. And then once the eyes do open, we have visual experience, we see. In our algorithm, we see that we have pre-eye opening with activity-based refinement, and then we have regular learning post-eye opening. However, we actually saw that it's the same thing. With the algorithm, activity-based learning can be applied to both pre-eye opening and post-eye opening. So using efficient coding at different times, we can create an algorithm that focuses on both and show the connection. So that's how we know that the visual system does develop. But for code, we're seeing how it should develop with our model of the lateral genetic nucleus and the visual cortex. And we can see, if we have the correct model, we can see the differences that could possibly occur and go into further detail explaining them. So to be able to create a model, we have to see, well, first of all, how would you make it? Like, what would you use? And then what can we do with it? So if we did have a high-level computational understanding of the visual system, we can predict more about the nature of spontaneous activity in the brain. And we can learn more about innate learning processes that occur, as well as we can continue predicting the nature of neural signals that happen. So how can we create a model using Python? Well, we can't really recreate retinal waves easily, so instead we use a very simple percolation cluster. And percolation theory relies on the fact that often clumping will occur in different parts of a random environment. And percolation clusters with a threshold of 0.5, what they are, they'll increase, like the white will increase, and it's showing how with clumping, it'll expand across the entire image. So when we have this percolation threshold increasing, we see different things happening. And we basically see it spreading like a wildfire. It'll increase as the percolation threshold also increases. And we see something actually really interesting when we have a threshold of 0.592. We see that a fractal actually occurs, and we have fractal self-similarity. I just thought that was interesting. There's really no point in talking about that, but it's kind of cool. And so with percolation clusters, it'll help us generate patterns for our model, because we need a pattern generator that is A, decentralized, B, relies solely on local interactions, and C, has similar statistical structure across multiple scales. So we want something that could be realistically conceived in the real world, basically. And so this is how we do it. We need to see whether the virtual model can contain similar structure when viewed across multiple scales, and this is a way to do that. So this is something that that's often done with receptive fields. So we can take the receptive fields or the percolation clusters in the model and use it for pattern samples. And from these pattern samples, we can actually take the threshold and plot it in a phase space graph. We can also fit it with ICA filters and fitted Gabors. And through all this, we can see how this early visual development compares with late visual development. For example, in an adult, like the red bar over there in the orientation bandwidth graph is that of an adult. It compares to how the visual system happens with early child development. So in conclusion, with the model, we're able to eliminate the line between pre and post eye opening for our algorithm, as activity-based learning serves to function for both of them. We're able to train the visual cortex to further understand the principles of sight and depth. So through Python and through creating this model, we're able to understand why these retinal waves occur, and it's because of a result of innate learning and how the retina works and how these receptive fields occur as a result of this. And through this, we can understand the patterns of neuroactivity in reference to their existence in visual development. And biologically and through computer science, we can see that they match, explaining and showing how we can train the brain before the eyes even open. And then acknowledgements, I want to thank Dr. Mark Albert, who can't be here right now, but he's my advisor, Associate Professor of Computer Science here at Loyola. From Cornell University, David Field and Adam. And then funding, and I'd like to thank IMSA for giving me this opportunity to be here. Thank you. Yeah, what she was asking is how, I mentioned before that the visual systems are actually kind of similar within different species, but she's wondering between like felines and different animals, how is it different? So basically, we didn't really look that much into that, but instead we looked at the retinal waves that occur, because we saw this similarity that occurs across the different animals, and that's the main thing we're investigating. But that's a great thing to look into, maybe to further advance this. So yeah, I think it's definitely possible that with different age groups, we can see different retinal activity happening. But either way, the retinal waves will occur over time. It just could be different, like phase, bandwidth, orientation. Yeah. Okay, so he's wondering what orientation bandwidth means and like what the graph represents. So what it's showing is that the adult vision is in red, and that's like kind of our base model of how adults see, and it's a measuring of like the retinal waves. So on the blue is saying with different pattern samples, how does it compare? That's actually what I'm studying right now. That's my current project I'm working on with Dr. Albert on Wednesdays. I'm looking at how we can actually optimize these fitted Gabors and the ICA filters to coincide with binocular vision. So he's wondering how does, basically how is the eye trained? How does retinal waves actually help? Okay.
I'm wondering, how do the systems that are presented here, like how can they help improve current learning systems of learning?
Oh, okay.
This is basically showing us how and why retinal waves, because we have a pretty general understanding of retinal waves right now. We want to see if we were to use Python to create a virtual model, see if we can improve our understanding of the lateral genetic nucleus, the visual cortex, and the data that we get from that, like the receptive fields. So he was asking a question about how we can advance this with disabilities and seeing how and whether that is different. That's something we haven't looked into yet, but I think that'd be something actually pretty interesting to look at. It would work kind of with Asma's project with disabilities and tracking and stuff. So yeah.
I'll bring on one more question. So Python-wise,
yeah.
Can you list a couple tools or something, anything that you use?
I personally wasn't the one that did the coding. It was Dr. Albert. So
you made Professor Albert do all the coding?
I mean,
you truly are a genius.
I joined the project once he was finished coding, and he was like, oh, well, I think it'd be cool if we had a high schooler present at Chipy. I was like, oh, well, I'll do it.
Very cool. Very, very cool. And is it the first? It's the second, but second in 11 years. So congratulations. That's awesome. Is anybody impressed? I'm impressed. Very, very good job.
Thank you,
very
sir.
well presented.
Thank you.
So I lifted the 1 beer limit today because of the light turnout. So congratulations for getting out in the cold today and coming to the best meeting you've ever experienced, will ever experience until next month. Woo! Sure. So a couple things I want to say. First off is thank you very much to Mark, Albert, and Loyola. This is a really great venue, is it not? Why did we not bring electronic helicopters with us? Because we could have do some fancy stuff. I don't know, probably crash. I want to thank, all of our sponsors for buying our 2-drink limit today, because I want another drink. And also Loyola also bought the food today, which was really awesome. And this venue's great, it really is. But finally, that's not all, folks. There's more. Video is back. Thank you, Chicago Latino TV. He has a show. He does professional recording. He's getting more professional services. Hit him up if you need some video recording. We are finally back online. Expect a lot of downloads, folks. I mentioned Beasley's talk on the Gill. This is going to be even more shattering. This is going to be better than that. Okay, Beasley can just sit down. Okay, he's not even here. He can just sit down, forget his books and all that pretty stuff, and all his hackery. We really want to hit all levels, so we haven't hit Django for a while, guys.
Some of the examples are like hidden Markov models and neural networks with time lag. So here's a little pictorial representation of a hidden Markov model. We do not know what, imagine that we want to predict based on online data. We want to find out if a person's friend on social media is a good friend or is it really a friend on social media. So we're just given certain observations, like is the person tagged very often in pictures with the other person, or if the person only likes and comments on person's status updates. So based on information like this, we can able to, hidden Markov models are able to predict the actual current state of the user. So what exactly a Markov model is, it has certain states, for example, walking and standing, and there are certain probabilities associated with the states. The model transitions from one state to the next, and it follows the Markov property. That is, the current state only depends on the previous state and not on the complete history. And as you can see, in a Markov chain, the states are directly observable. But a hidden Markov model is exactly like a Markov model. It has n states. The process transitions from state to state. It assumes that the states are hidden. Also, each state generates emissions or observations, and based on the observations, we can to be able to successfully identify the activities of patients that are suffering with motor disabilities, such as those with spinal cord injury presented here. Patients undergo various therapies to improve motor function. But to know which therapies are the most effective and how to adjust the parameters of those therapies, it is important to be able to collect data on patient outcomes as conveniently, objectively, and continuously as possible. And that is why we need activity recognition. Now, what exactly is activity recognition? It's just a technique to be able to measure the current activity levels of the subject based on data collected from certain sensors such as accelerometers, gyroscopes, etc. Today, many commercial devices are available that can measure step counts, calorie estimates, or even general activity levels. But most of them are designed for healthy subjects and may not give very accurate results when used on patient populations with motor disabilities. Previous study conducted earlier has shown that activity recognition accuracy can greatly improve if we adapt our classifiers to data collected from movements of the certain patient populations. And successful activity recognition can really help researchers and clinicians assess the effect of those therapies on the behavior at home. Here's a clip showing the recorded accelerometer data. As you can see, it shows the accelerations along the X, Y, and Z axis.
We haven't hit, Raspberry Pi stuff for a while, We haven't broken into any banks and got arrested for a while. I did, but that's a different story. And then, go ahead. This is Jason Wither.
So just a couple of announcements on the conference front. If anybody's in New York next weekend, I think on the 22nd and 23rd, PyData is going to be in New York. So that's a data science specific conference. I think it runs for 2 days, tutorials, talks, things like that. I think the talks they'll be online for those who can't make it. In addition, PyCon is coming up. It's going to be, I think, from April 8th of 2015. So they have early bird tickets that are on sale, save you $50 on admission, which means $50 more to spend on booze at the actual PyCon. Those are, I think, 60% sold out, and they're going to the first 800 people. There's generally about maybe 3,000 people that show up to PyCon, and it's sold out every year for the past however many years. So I think it's good to get those tickets early and organize that trip, because it's definitely one of the most used.
Give a warm welcome.
Introducing myself, I'm Asma Mehjabeen. I'm a graduate student here at Loyola, and I'm doing my master's in computer science. Today, I would like to talk about how hidden Markov models can be used to improve activity recognition in patients with incomplete spinal cord injuries. The main motivation behind the study is even a common device such as a regular mobile phone will give you signals like this. And based on information from this clip, we can identify the activities such as sitting, wheeling, walking, stair climbing, etc. How is this done? Commonly this is done by extracting 10-second clips from the data and having your algorithms classify those data based on features within that time frame. And since we only consider features within that certain clip, it's called a static classification. Some of the examples include linear regression, logistic regression, support vector machines. Basically, like very similar to linear regression, but here it predicts the value of a categorical variable given the values of like continuous, like dependent categorical variable, like given one or more independent variables. It usually gives the probability of outcome of a categorical variable given one or more independent variables based on a logistic function. So that's where the name logistic regression comes from. Like, even though like static classification can give us accurate results, we wanted to find out if we can better improve the accuracy by augmenting the static classifiers with a dynamic model instead. So that's why we also like chose a dynamic estimation. What dynamic estimation does is it not only considers the information present in this one particular clip, but it also considers the context of the clip over time, which leads to higher accuracies.